India's struggle for independence was a long, long road, but something happened right around 1919 that completely changed the game. A movement that had been simmering for decades suddenly, and I mean suddenly, caught fire. In this explainer, we're going to get right into what lit that fuse.
Okay, so let's start with the big question that drives this whole story. For years, the fight for Indian independence was, let's be honest, mostly a thing for the educated upper-class circles. It was a debate. But after 1919, it just exploded into this massive nationwide movement. So why then? What was the spark? To figure that out, we're going to break it down into 4 parts. First, we'll look at how this thing really did catch fire across the country. Then, we'll dive into the incredible pressures that came out of World War I. After that, we'll meet the new kind of leader who showed up right on time. And finally, we'll check out his pretty unusual strategy, a whole year of just listening. All right, let's kick things off with the transformation itself. This wasn't just about getting more people involved. No, this was a fundamental shift in what the independence struggle even was. Here's the absolute key takeaway. After 1919, the fight against the British wasn't just happening in fancy meeting halls anymore. It spilled out onto the streets, into the villages, into the fields. For the very first time, it became a genuine mass movement. And just look at who was suddenly in the mix. We're talking peasants, tribal communities, students, women showing up in huge numbers. You've got factory workers. And then by the 1920s, even big business groups were throwing their weight behind the cause. This was a coalition of people that was completely unheard of before. So what on earth brought them all together? Well, the main catalyst was an event that shook the entire planet, the First World War. Even though it was fought thousands of miles away, the fallout landed right on India's doorstep, and believe it or not, created the perfect storm for a revolution. Yeah, the war wasn't some distant headline for India. It radically, fundamentally changed the economic and political situation on the ground. It created so much hardship and discontent that the British government just couldn't keep a lid on it anymore.
So let's break down that pressure. To pay for the war, the British government went on a massive spending spree for its military. And how do they pay for it? Well, they jacked up taxes on personal incomes and on business profits. For regular people, this meant the price of everyday stuff went through the roof. It was a huge, painful squeeze.
And this created what was basically a tale of two Indias. You had ordinary folks struggling with these crazy price hikes, while at the same time, Indian business groups were making incredible profits. The war created this huge demand for things like jute bags and cloth. And since foreign goods weren't coming in, Indian industries just boomed. So you have one group suffering while another is thriving. That's a recipe for some serious resentment. But the cost wasn't just about money. The British also needed more soldiers, a lot more. So they pressured villages to send their sons to fight and die, for what, to many, felt like a totally alien cause. This kind of forced recruitment created a really deep rift between rural India and their colonial rulers. And here's a fascinating twist. When these soldiers eventually came back home, they weren't the same. They had served overseas, and they had seen with their own eyes how imperial powers were exploiting people all over Asia and Africa. They came back with a whole new perspective and a real fire in their bellies to fight colonialism in their own homeland. Now, on top of all this turmoil happening inside India, another huge event was shaking up the world stage, and the year to remember is 1917. That, of course, was the year of the Russian Revolution. News about peasants and workers rising up to overthrow their own rulers, well, that spread like wildfire. These powerful new ideas about socialism gave Indian nationalists a brand new playbook and a massive dose of inspiration. The ground was officially fertile for change. So, into this perfect storm of economic pain, social anger, and new political ideas, one person walks onto the stage. And this, my friends, is where Mahatma Gandhi enters the story. So, in 1915, Gandhi arrives in India from South Africa. He's 46 years old, and he is not some unknown figure. He's already a well-respected leader on the world stage, famous for his nonviolent campaigns against racist laws in South Africa. He came to India with a serious track record. So what really made him a mass leader? Well, his work in South Africa had forced him to connect with an incredible mix of Indians, Hindus, Muslims, Parsis, Christians, people from all over the subcontinent, from every social class imaginable. He already knew how to build the exact kind of broad-based movement that India desperately needed at this moment. But here's the thing. Even with all his fame and experience, Gandhi didn't just show up and start a movement. His first move was something completely different, something that would become the absolute bedrock of his entire philosophy: a year of listening. His strategy was so simple, yet so brilliant. For his whole first year back, he just traveled. He crisscrossed the country. He wanted to understand the people, their problems, and the situation as a whole, not from reading reports, but from meeting them, face to face. He knew he couldn't lead a people he didn't truly understand. So you see, the stage was perfectly set. The immense pressures from the First World War had created a nation that was angry, that was inspired, and that was absolutely ready for a massive change. The soil was ready for something big to grow. And that really brings us to the final thought here. The ingredients for a mass movement were already there, bubbling right under the surface. Gandhi just happened to arrive at the perfect moment. So the question is, did he create this movement from nothing, or was he more like a brilliant conductor who saw an entire orchestra just sitting there, waiting, and knew exactly how to bring all those different instruments together to create one powerful symphony? Now that's something to think about. You know, between 1919 and 1922, something incredible happened. India's whole struggle for freedom just completely transformed. What started as a few local protests suddenly exploded into this massive, nationwide movement, all armed with a powerful new idea. So let's dive into this really critical period that basically set the stage for everything that came after. It's a huge question, right? How does that actually happen? Well, for India, the answer really lies in these 3 pivotal years. We're going to see exactly how a mix of incredible leadership, a seriously unpopular law, and a powerful call for unity turned all this scattered frustration into a truly formidable national revolt. So, before you can launch a huge national movement, you kind of have to test your methods, right? Well, Mahatma Gandhi had just returned to India, and he was already busy sharpening his unique strategy of nonviolent resistance, but on a much smaller scale. And believe me, he was having some remarkable success.
Now, what's so important to see here is the groundwork being laid. Before 1919, Gandhi's work in places like Champaran and Kheda, and especially that successful mill workers' strike in Ahmedabad, proved that his ideas could actually work in the real world. These local wins built up his reputation and gave him the proof of concept he needed to go big. Every massive fire needs a spark, right? For India, back in 1919, that spark was a new law passed by the British. And let's just say it was seen as a direct attack on the most basic freedoms of every single person in the country. And there it is, just a simple sentence, but one that would completely change the course of history. The Rowlatt Act of 1919. It was designed to shut people up, to suppress any kind of dissent. But instead, it did the exact opposite. It lit a fire that would spread across the entire subcontinent. So why was this law so awful? I mean, just look at what it did. It basically gave the government emergency powers, even in peacetime. They could shut down free speech, they could beef up police powers, and worst of all, they could arrest anyone they wanted and throw them in jail for 2 years, without even a trial. It was a total assault on civil liberties. Devilish and tyrannical. I mean, listen to those words. That wasn't just some exaggeration for political effect. This quote from leaders like Gandhi and Jinnah, it perfectly captures that universal feeling of just pure shock and betrayal. They were arguing that no government, anywhere, has the right to just strip people of their basic freedoms like that. So, in response, Gandhi proposed something totally new, something on a national scale: satyagraha. This wasn't just another protest. It was a call for nonviolent, civil resistance. He asked all Indians to observe a nationwide hartal, which is a strike, as a day of humiliation and prayer. This was it. This was the birth of the first all-India struggle. But what happens when a call for peaceful protest is met with an iron fist? Well, the British government's response to the satyagraha would lead to a tragedy so horrific, it became a point of no return for the freedom movements. As these peaceful protests and strikes started spreading like wildfire across the country in April of 1919, the government started to get scared. And their response wasn't to talk, it wasn't to listen. Nope, it was to crush the movement with just brutal, raw violence. This date, this city, they're now forever etched into history.
It was Baisakhi, a huge festival day in Punjab. Thousands of people, we're talking men, women, and children, had gathered peacefully in a walled garden in Amritsar called Jallianwala Bagh. What happened next is it's almost unimaginable. A man named General Dyer ordered his troops to block the only way out of that garden. And then, with no warning at all, he told them to open fire on the unarmed crowd. It was a massacre. The fact that people later would just point to the bullet marks still scarred into the walls, it speaks volumes about the trauma that was inflicted on the nation that day.
Okay, to really get the impact of what happens next, you have to understand what a knighthood meant back then. It was one of the highest honors the British crown could give a civilian. It was a massive symbol of prestige inside the empire.
And that is what makes this so incredibly powerful. The celebrated poet, a Nobel laureate, Rabindranath Tagore, renounced his knighthood. He was essentially giving back the crown's highest honor, telling the world, your awards are meaningless when you are massacring my people. It was a gesture that expressed the pain of an entire country.
So the anger over the Jallianwala Bagh massacre was just immense. But then another issue, this one an international one, would come along and merge with it, creating this unprecedented opportunity for Hindu-Muslim unity against the British.
Think of it like this. You've got two huge streams of anger, and they're about to merge into one giant river. On one hand, you had the Punjab wrongs, the absolute fury over the massacre that outraged everybody. And at the exact same time, Indian Muslims were incensed over the Khilafat wrong, a really harsh treaty the British were imposing on the Turkish Sultan, who was also the Caliph, or Khalifa, the spiritual leader for Sunni Muslim.
And this is where Gandhi's vision was just so crucial. He saw this as the perfect moment to unite Hindus and Muslims for a common cause. So when the Caliphate leaders Muhammad Ali and Shaukat Ali called for a full-on non-cooperation movement, Gandhi immediately supported them. This was more than just a political alliance. It was a powerful statement about creating a national identity that went beyond religion, building a united front the British couldn't just divide and conquer.
So now, with this united front, the non-cooperation movement gained this incredible momentum. It wasn't just about protests anymore. This was about actively withdrawing all cooperation from the British system, trying to paralyze it from the inside out. And the response from the people was just staggering. We're talking thousands of students and teachers walking out of government schools. Famous lawyers just gave up their successful practices. People returned their British titles, they boycotted official events, and then, in this amazing act of economic defiance, they lit these huge public bonfires of foreign-made cloth. And you might wonder, did any of this actually work? Well, take a look. This wasn't just symbolic. It had a real economic bite. The imports of foreign cloth, which was a huge British industry, they fell drastically between 1920 and 1922. The boycott was hitting the British Empire exactly where it hurt, in the wallet. And that, right there, is the key takeaway. All these actions, the students walking out, the lawyers quitting, the burning cloth, they were really just the tip of the iceberg. Beneath the surface, the source tells us, huge parts of the country were just simmering, right on the very brink of a massive, formidable revolt. The foundation for a true mass struggle had finally been laid. Which really leaves us with a final thought, doesn't it? These ideas that were forged in India 100 years ago, satyagraha, non-cooperation, mass civil disobedience, they didn't just stay there. So the question is, how do we see these incredibly powerful tactics of peaceful resistance still shaping struggles for justice and freedom all around the world today? We all know the name Mahatma Gandhi, right? But today, we're going to peel back the layers on a different part of his story. We're going to explore how his powerful message of nonviolence wasn't just heard, but was interpreted and, honestly, often radically transformed by the very people he was trying to lead. And this quote, wow, it gets right to the heart of everything. For Gandhi, nonviolence, or ahimsa, wasn't a passive thing. It was a powerful, active force. The whole idea was to undo injustice by willingly taking on the suffering yourself without ever wishing harm on your opponent. I mean, what a truly radical concept. So, you see, this wasn't just some clever political tactic. For Gandhi, it was this deeply held belief. It was about doing the right thing with absolutely no expectation of reward. It was a moral, almost spiritual commitment to changing society through personal sacrifice. Okay, but here's where things get really fascinating. While Gandhi's call for nonviolent resistance was like this one single powerful note, the way it echoed across the sheer vastness of India, Well, that was anything but uniform. Different communities heard it, and you could say they started playing their own tunes. And this is the most crucial point. People didn't just follow Gandhi's instructions to the letter. No, they connected his huge national movement to their own local problems, their fights against landlords, their struggles against colonial rules, their anger over unfair taxes. This created this incredible groundswell, a true grassroots movement, but one that didn't always, line up perfectly with what Gandhi had in mind. Let's actually take a little tour of these regional actions, and we'll start in Kheda, Gujarat. Here, you had Patidar peasants who were just getting crushed by high land revenue demands from the British. So they took Gandhi's call and applied it directly to their situation, organizing nonviolent campaigns against this very specific economic injustice. It's a really classic example of these principles in action. All right, now let's head south. In places like coastal Andhra and deep into Tamil Nadu, a whole different form of protest took hold: the picketing of liquor shops. This was another nonviolent tactic that became super popular, targeting a social issue that a lot of people felt was tied directly to colonial exploitation. And when we say picketing, just so we're all on the same page, it's pretty simple. It's when people protest outside a building, like a shop, to try and stop others from going inside. It was a really simple, very visible, and powerful way to cause a disruption without violence. Anyone could do it. Now let's jump to a totally different context over in Punjab. Here, the Sikh community's Akali agitation wasn't about taxes at all. It was about reclaiming their sacred spaces, their gurudwaras, from corrupt religious leaders, or mahants, who also happened to be backed by the British. For them, their struggle was absolutely part of the larger non-cooperation movement. And again, just a quick definition for you, mahants were the religious officials in charge of these Sikh gurdwaras. The protesters felt that these particular leaders had become totally corrupt and were basically acting as puppets for the British colonial government. I get a load of this powerful example from Assam. Tea garden laborers who were fighting for a major pay raise literally just walked off the British-owned plantations. And you know what they were shouting? Gandhi Maharaj Ki Jai, which means victory to Gandhi, the great king. They were explicitly saying they were following his wishes, tying their labor fight directly to his name and his authority. So all of this brings us to the real heart of the story, right? This tension, this gap between the ideal message that Gandhi was preaching and the on-the-ground reality of how people were actually practicing it. This slide here really lays out the disconnect. Gandhi's vision was huge. He wanted national unity that crossed class lines. He wanted to get rid of all unjust laws. But on the ground, people translated that into something much more immediate, much more tangible. Class unity became a rallying cry to fight oppressive landlords. Unjust laws meant getting rid of those specific forest rules that stopped them from grazing their cattle. The grand idea was meeting local reality, and it was changing. A perfect example of this was the so-called forest satyagrahas down in Andhra Pradesh. Here, tribal communities and poor peasants just took direct action. They defiantly sent their cattle into the restricted forest without paying a single colonial grazing fee. Now, they weren't just breaking a rule. They were acting on his powerful belief that Gandhi Raj, Gandhi's rule, was just around the corner. And in that new world, these oppressive rules just wouldn't exist anymore. In this whole process, it starts to build into something even more profound. The way people were interpreting Gandhi's message wasn't just political anymore. It was becoming deeply personal and, for many, deeply spiritual. The man, Mohandas Gandhi, was starting to transform into a myth, the Mahatma Phule. So we really have to ask ourselves, was he just a political leader to the average person? Well, all the evidence seems to suggest he was something much, much more than that. People started to see him as this messiah-like figure, almost a savior who could magically end all their suffering. You had agricultural laborers who genuinely believed he would personally provide them with land. And there's this incredible story from Pratapgarh, where peasants organized and successfully stopped illegal evictions. And who did they give the credit to? Not themselves. They credited Gandhi. They felt he had won the victory for them. This transformation seeped deep into the culture. I mean, think back to those tea laborers in Assam. In the religious songs of that time, the name of the god Krishna was sometimes literally swapped out for Gandhi Raja, or King Gandhi. He was being woven into the very fabric of their faith. And this deification was even captured in popular art. You'd see these images from the time that didn't just show Gandhi as a politician. Oh no. They often showed him as a divine figure, taking on the role of the god Krishna, driving the chariot and guiding the other leaders into battle. He wasn't just a man anymore. He was truly the Mahatma, the great soul with what people believed was divine power. So, what is the big takeaway from all of this? What does it really tell us about how these huge mass movements actually work?
Well, ultimately, the incredible power of India's freedom struggle didn't just flow down from Gandhi. It surged up from the millions of people who heard his message, filtered it through their own lives and experiences, and then reshaped it to fight their own battles. It was a dynamic, two-way street between the leader and the people.
And that leaves us with one final, pretty provocative thought. When a population takes a leader's message and adapts it, even in ways the leader never intended, is that a betrayal of the original idea? Or is that the ultimate sign that the message has truly taken root and become a real movement of the people? Something to think about.
All right. Today we're jumping into one of the most complex and, honestly, one of the most important decades in India's struggle for freedom, the 1920s. It was a time of really deep divisions and some pretty radical ideas that, surprisingly, ended up forging a brand new kind of unity.
I mean, that's a huge question, right? And the answer is almost never simple. It's not usually just one big battle or one single leader. It's messy.
And back in 1920s India, this question was anything but theoretical. It was a live, fierce debate happening in villages and cities all across the subcontinent. The path forward? Nobody was really sure. So, how did this whole decade of dissent even begin? Well, the nationalist movement was really reeling, shaken by a major setback that left absolutely everyone at a critical crossroads. It all came to a head in February 1922. In this small town, Chauri Chaura, a protest turned violent and 22 policemen were killed. For Mahatma Gandhi, a man whose entire philosophy was built on nonviolence, well, this was a disaster. He just abruptly called off the entire nationwide non-cooperation movement. And that single decision fractured the movement, leaving all these nationalists divided and asking one really desperate question. What do we do now?
From all that uncertainty, two main paths really started to emerge. First up, we have the Gandhian path, led of course by Mahatma Gandhi and his followers.
You know, to really get the sheer scale of Gandhi's influence, just look at this quote. This isn't from a supporter. This is from a British Criminal Investigation Department report in 1921. Even the colonial officials were just astonished by his reach. To millions of ordinary Indians, he wasn't just a political leader, he was a Mahatma, a great soul. What he said went.
So, what was Gandhi's big plan after the chaos of Chauri Chaura? He called for constructive work. Now, this wasn't a retreat, it was a really smart, strategic pivot. Instead of direct confrontation, his followers fanned out into rural areas. They focused on things like ending untouchability, promoting hand-spun cloth, and trying to foster Hindu-Muslim unity. The whole philosophy was simple but really profound. True freedom, Swaraj, wasn't just about kicking the British out. It was about building a self-reliant, morally strong nation from the ground up. This was the long game, all rooted in a deep faith in nonviolent discipline.
But here's the thing. Not everyone had the patience for that long-term approach. A younger, more militant generation of nationalists was getting frustrated. They felt like there was no immediate progress, and they believed a radically different path was needed.
And this quote from the revolutionary Bhagat Singh, it perfectly captures their whole philosophy. They felt the British government was totally deaf to peaceful demands. To them, years of patient work had gotten them almost nowhere. They believed only a dramatic, loud action, a real shock to the system, would force the colonial rulers to finally listen. And they put this philosophy into, explosive practice. In 1928, they formed the Hindustan Socialist Republican Association, or HSRA. These guys were inspired not just by nationalism, but by socialist ideas about overthrowing economic exploitation, too. Their actions escalated fast. First, the assassination of Saunders, a police officer they blamed for the death of a senior nationalist leader. Then, the famous bombing of the Central Legislative Assembly. And get this, they used harmless explosives. The point wasn't to kill, but, just as their leaflet said, to make the deaf hear. Their goal was really twofold: get the British out and empower India's workers and peasants. The stakes here were, of course, incredibly high. Bhagat Singh was just 23 years old when he was executed for his actions. That number just starkly underscores the immense sacrifice and revolutionary fire of these young nationalists. So there you have it. Two fundamentally different visions for how to achieve the exact same goal. You have the Gandhian path, nonviolent, patient, focused on building a moral and economic base in rural India. And then you have the revolutionary path, immediate, forceful, aimed at a swift political and social revolution. And these weren't just two separate tracks running side by side. The revolutionaries' bold actions often forced the mainstream nationalist movement to take a more radical stance, while Gandhi's huge mass appeal created a nationwide consciousness that the revolutionaries could then tap into.
So you have these two groups on completely different tracks, but then an external event, an act of pure British arrogance, suddenly made all their deep ideological divides seem kind of irrelevant.
Okay, so in 1927, the British government sends a commission to India, led by a guy named Lord Simon, to decide the country's political future. It had one fatal, incredibly insulting flaw. There was not a single Indian representative on it. The British were literally going to decide India's future without talking to a single Indian.
The sheer arrogance of that decision caused an immediate and universal outrage. All of a sudden, it didn't matter if you were a Gandhian or a revolutionary. Everyone was insulted, and everyone agreed on one thing. This commission had to be boycotted.
And this simple, powerful three-word slogan just echoed across the entire country. When the commission arrived, it was met everywhere with black flags and massive crowds chanting, "Simon, go back." It was this incredible, totally unforeseen moment of nationwide unity. And this newfound unity, born from this shared sense of outrage, it propelled the movement towards a radical new goal. This would become the climax of the entire decade.
And here it is, the result. The decade that began in so much division and confusion closed with an act of stunning clarity. The Indian National Congress, the country's main political body, declared its ultimate goal. They were no longer asking for dominion status or some form of self-government within the British Empire. Nope. The goal was now Purna Swaraj, complete, absolute, no strings attached independence.
Let's just trace that incredible arc one last time. The decade kicks off with these deep divisions after Chauri Chaura. Then, in 1927, the Simon Commission accidentally unites everybody in protest. This momentum just keeps building, and by the Lahore session in 1929, with a young Jawaharlal Nehru as president, the Congress makes its historic declaration. And to mark this, January 26, 1930, was observed all across the country as the first Independence Day, a powerful, symbolic statement of exactly what they intended to do.
And this brings us to a final, really powerful question. The 1920s in India show us a movement with one goal, freedom. But these fiercely competing ideas on how to actually get there. It really makes you wonder, when a destination is shared, but the maps are totally different, which journey is the one that truly defines the struggle? Is it the patient, steady work of building a foundation from the ground up? Or is it that revolutionary spark that demands to be heard right now?